It's actually, in fact, the very nature of unapologetically allowing his obsessions to take center stage in his work that actually makes me love Miyazaki as much as I do as an artist. You know, the first obsession I want to cover here from the book is that of his obsession with planes. And, you know, when you look at films like The Wind Rises, which is almost entirely centered on one character's pursuit of building a plane, you know, that's a film where the influences are very heavy. But, you know, when you look at films like Castle in the Sky, Laputa, you see the main character of Padzu is actually working on a plane that might be able to take him to Laputa at the start of the film. And when you look at films like My Neighbor Totoro, it's really subtle, but the neighbor boy who lives in the town, another favorite character of mine, that character is seen to be holding a model of a plane. So these obsessions unapologetically make their way into his films. The book says, growing up after an all-out war, the young Miyazaki loved to draw military planes, an obsession that would pay off in the stunning flying scenes in his movies. Yes, there are many of those. In fact, the name Ghibli of Studio Ghibli is actually named after an Italian military aircraft of the same name. A lot of people don't actually know that. It sounds like a Japanese word, but it's actually an Arabic word in origin, which roughly translates to a hot, fiercely wind. Back to the book, Miyazaki's first and enduring artistic love was for machines, starting with the red fire engines that he drew as a young child and continuing to the planes that fascinated him after the war. It goes on further to say Miyazaki likely inherited his fascinations with machinery from his grandfather, who had held patents on several inventions. I have a strong desire to be liberated from being tied down by reality, he once said, speaking of his love of drawing airships. I was an overly self-conscious boy, and I had a hard time holding my own fights with others, but my classmates eventually accepted me because I was good at drawing. I expressed my desire for power by drawing huge airplanes with sleek and pointed noses and battleships with huge guns. You know, there's an interesting extension to this quote, which is, and I even found myself thrilled with the bravery of sailors who, even as their burning ships sank, continued to fire guns until the bitter end. And it's this kind of bravery that I think is often portrayed in Miyazaki's films, with characters acting without any hesitation or any moments of self-doubt. You know, they also have these moments that reflect this quote here, like Jiro at the start of The Wind Rises actually standing up to bullies. And so even in smaller moments from the child's perspective of standing up to bullies to the larger moments where a fire is occurring and people are needing to be saved, like in that of Nausicaa, the main characters reflect Miyazaki's admiration of bravery and quick decision-making that comes from that bravery. But back to his obsessions, it's important to note that Miyazaki's drawings did exceed that of an average person's or child's at his young age. It is undeniable that he had talent. And this is something that perhaps we don't want to admit too much about artists that we want to, learn from, because it's hard to just replicate talent, but it is undeniable. This is an important thing to note, because one of my favorite stories that I learned from this book was that he and his older brother Arata, who was older than him by 2 years old, when they were in elementary school, actually both entered a drawing competition. And to enter this, they actually drew from a second floor balcony as they overlooked the garden that they lived in, both reflecting, of course, his affluent background, but also influences his later films like The Wind Rises, that has Jiro sat on the second floor balcony looking out as he's reading about planes. But it was from this second floor that they drew the gardens and submitted those into the competitions, but where Arata, the brother, actually won the competition, but only because the teachers refused to believe that Hayao's drawings were actually done by a child. So they noted that the drawings were just too good. And, there's no way that they could have been done by this child that was 2 years younger than his older brother. So just gave the older brother the award for the competition, which naturally highlights that both of them were talented, but the younger brother supremely so. Arata actually admits to seeing Hayao being able to draw at a level that he couldn't imitate, and noting that his younger brother had a gifted ability to, in his words, draw everything correctly. But it was this level of detail that makes its way into Miyazaki's films, as his films are unique in being able to create what critic Eleanor Cameron describes as particularity of place, which is that he's able to create stories that sit within a larger whole that was both textured and real. I actually note that when you watch Totoro, you're very quickly able to mentally map the house as well as the layout of the land around it, despite it being populated by only rivers, fields, and trees, which, if you think from an animated perspective, are either just green or blue, So Miyazaki's very intentional about creating worlds that you can easily place. And it's something that also happens in Laputa. The initial sequence all takes place in a village that's surrounded by mountains, but the mountains are very high and very steep in the way that they are kind of placed. And there's almost this train line that runs through it, but it all works and moves in a way and that's both highly detailed, which is very unique of animation films for backgrounds to be so detailed, but also are built in a way that you can always place the characters. You know where they're going, you know where they're coming from, you know what's behind them, you know where things sit. And I think that's something beautifully done. It's that kind of specificity and detail in the backgrounds that gives each moment its place. The European architecture that stands out in films like Laputa and Kiki is also worth mentioning because despite the most powerful passport in the world being Japanese, actually less than 20% of the Japanese population actually own a passport. This is actually a reflection of two things that are happening in Japan. One, which is that a lot of people feel that their own country is beautiful enough to explore, and thus all their vacations and holidays need to be centered around these beautiful locations worth exploring. But it's also indicative of the fact that Japanese people actually lack vacations. They don't really go on holidays. They don't spend weeks at a time away from their work, and so are kind of unable to actually utilize the passport that's allegedly so powerful. So you can imagine the European architecture actually kind of heightens the sense of adventure and fantasy. This is something that Miyazaki does because he takes the knowledge and mental capturing of his travels in places across Europe and then brings that to Eastern audiences. So even for yourself, as much as you can, see where you can take the unfamiliar and bring it to the familiar, because it's usually the melding of the two that makes for beautiful art.